One morning in the quiet solitude of rural Montana, wildlife veterinarian Margaret Russell opened her door and was shocked to find a skinny, dusty bobcat standing on the doorstep, its eyes filled with a strange mix of recognition and longing. The wild animal stood still, staring into the house as if it remembered the place, its body trembling with a mix of caution and hope. As Margaret approached, she realized in disbelief that it was the same young bobcat she and her husband had rescued and raised temporarily before it wandered off into the wild 5 months ago. They had searched nearby woods and asked around, but eventually accepted that it might never return. Now, its unexpected appearance overwhelmed them with emotion. But why had this wild creature chosen to come back? This is the story of trust, survival, and the incredible moments when nature redefines the meaning of home. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Margaret Russell had always been an early riser, a habit formed during her 30 years as a wildlife veterinarian in rural Montana. Even now, at 68, with her practice handed over to younger, more energetic hands, she still woke with the sun. That crisp October morning started like any other, until she opened her front door to collect the newspaper and found herself face to face with a ghost from her past. The bobcat stood motionless on her wooden porch, its tawny coat dulled with dust and debris, ribs visible beneath matted fur. But it was the eyes that stopped Margaret's breath. Those distinctive amber eyes with flecks of green that she would recognize anywhere. "Rusty?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The animal's ears twitched at the name, and Margaret's heart nearly stopped. It was impossible, yet here he was, the same young bobcat she and her husband Tom had rescued 5 months ago after finding him orphaned and near death by the roadside. The call had come on a sweltering May afternoon. Tom Russell, recently retired from his job as a park ranger, answered the phone to find a frantic voice on the other end. "There's been an accident on Highway 2, the caller said. "A mother bobcat was hit by a semi. There's a kitten, looks real young, hiding in the brush. Animal control won't come out for hours, and the little thing won't last that long in this heat." Tom glanced at Margaret, who was already reaching for her veterinary bag. After 4 decades of marriage, they communicated in glances and gestures as much as words. They found the kitten exactly where the caller had described, a tiny ball of spotted fur huddled beneath a sagebrush, mewing pitifully for his mother. Margaret estimated he was perhaps 8 weeks old, far too young to survive on his own. His mother lay nearby, and Margaret's experienced eye told her immediately that the older cat's injuries were fatal. "She must have been moving him to a new den," Margaret murmured, gently scooping up the terrified kitten. "Probably his first time being moved." The drive home was tense. The kitten, whom Tom had already started calling Rusty due to his reddish-brown markings, was severely dehydrated and weak. Margaret held him close, feeling his tiny heart racing against her palm. Their property, a modest ranch house on 40 acres of woodland and meadow, had served as an unofficial wildlife rehabilitation center throughout Margaret's career. Though she was officially retired, the converted barn still contained recovery cages and medical equipment. For the first week, Rusty's survival was touch and go. Margaret fed him every 2 hours with a special formula, sleeping in the barn to monitor him around the clock. Tom took the day shifts, pacing anxiously as he waited for updates. Gradually, the kitten grew stronger. By the 3rd week, he was exploring his enclosure, pouncing on toys Margaret had placed inside. His personality began to emerge, playful, curious, but always with that wild edge that reminded them he was no house cat. "He's going to be a handful," Tom observed one evening as they watched Rusty attempt to scale the walls of his enclosure. "All the spirited ones are," Margaret replied with a smile. "That fighting spirit is probably what kept him alive." As summer progressed, Rusty grew rapidly. Margaret had handled dozens of bobcat rescues over the years, and she knew the importance of maintaining the animal's wild instincts while ensuring he developed the skills necessary for survival. They moved him to a larger outdoor enclosure where he could practice hunting with live mice and learn to fend for himself. Tom found himself spending hours sitting near the cage, talking to Rusty in a low, steady voice. The bobcat would approach the fence, sometimes even allowing Tom to scratch behind his ears through the mesh. Margaret warned against getting too attached, but she noticed how her husband's eyes lit up whenever Rusty responded to his voice. "He trusts us," Tom said one afternoon as Rusty dozed in a sunny corner of his cage. "Trust and dependence are two different things," Margaret reminded him gently. "Our job is to prepare him for a life in the wild, not to keep him as a pet." By September, Rusty was nearly full-grown, a magnificent specimen with the characteristic bobbed tail, tufted ears, and muscular frame of his species. Margaret knew it was time. After consulting with her contacts at the State Wildlife Department, they obtained the necessary permits for release. The plan was to perform a soft release, opening Rusty's cage and allowing him to leave on his own terms while still providing supplemental food for a transition period. Many rehabilitated wild animals chose to stay near their release site for days or weeks before venturing into truly wild territory. On a crisp September morning, Margaret and Tom opened Rusty's cage for the final time. The bobcat emerged cautiously, sniffing the air, his ears swiveling at every sound. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, looking back at the humans who had saved his life. "Go on, boy," Tom said softly. "You're free now." Rusty padded forward, examining the world beyond his cage. He spent several minutes exploring the immediate area, marking territory, testing his newfound freedom. As the sun climbed higher, he made his way toward the tree line, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the forest. For the next week, they left food out each evening. Sometimes it was gone by morning, though they couldn't be sure if Rusty or other wildlife had taken it. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of him, a flash of tawny fur in the underbrush, eyes reflecting in their flashlight beam during evening walks. Then, one morning in early October, the food remained untouched. The next night, same thing. A week passed with no signs of Rusty anywhere on their property. "He's doing what he's supposed to do," Margaret told Tom, though her voice held a note of sadness. "He's found his place in the wild." Tom nodded, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Over the next few weeks, they took long walks through their property and the surrounding forest, hoping for a glimpse of their former charge. They asked neighbors, checked with local hunters, even posted his picture online. But as autumn deepened into winter, they gradually accepted that Rusty had moved on to claim his own territory somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness. The long winter. Winter that year was particularly harsh. Record snowfalls buried the region for weeks at a time, and temperatures plummeted to dangerous lows. Margaret and Tom often found themselves thinking about Rusty, wondering if he had found adequate shelter, if his hunting skills were sufficient to sustain him through the brutal months. "He was ready," Margaret reminded herself as much as Tom during those long, dark evenings. "We taught him everything we could." Tom took to leaving small piles of meat near the edge of their property, just in case. Margaret didn't object, though they both knew the chances of Rusty finding them were slim. The offerings usually disappeared, taken by ravens, coyotes, or other scavengers, but it made Tom feel better. As winter gave way to spring, then summer, their hope of seeing Rusty again faded. Margaret resumed her volunteer work with the wildlife refuge, and Tom threw himself into various projects around the property. But sometimes, during their evening walks, they would both find themselves scanning the tree line, listening for any sound that might indicate their old friend's presence. The impossible return. Now standing face to face with Rusty on her doorstep that October morning, Margaret felt a collision of emotions: joy, disbelief, concern. The bobcat before her was clearly struggling. His coat, once glossy and full, hung loose on his frame. Scratches and scars marked his face and legs, testament to whatever battles he had fought during his time in the wild. "Tom," she called, her voice catching. "Tom, come quickly." She heard the familiar sound of her husband's slippers shuffling across the hardwood floor, his morning routine interrupted. "What's wrong, Maggie?" His voice held concern until he reached the door and saw what had captured his wife's attention. The coffee mug in his hand trembled, then fell, shattering on the wooden porch. "Is that?" he began, unable to finish the question. Rusty's eyes moved between them, and Margaret could swear she saw recognition there. The bobcat took a tentative step forward, then another. His movement was stiff, suggesting injury or malnutrition, but there was something in his posture that spoke of trust rather than aggression. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered, slowly crouching down. "Look how thin you are. What happened to you out there?" As if understanding the gentle tone, Rusty approached Tom's outstretched hand. When the bobcat didn't shy away from his touch, Tom gently scratched behind his ear, just as he had done so many times through the cage fence. Margaret's professional instincts kicked in. He needs food and water, and I should examine him, but slowly. We don't want to overwhelm him. They moved with practiced efficiency, Tom staying with Rusty while Margaret gathered supplies. She returned with a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from dinner the night before. Rusty drank greedily, then approached the food with evident hunger but surprising restraint. Perhaps a learned behavior from lean times in the wild. As he ate, Margaret observed his condition more carefully. He was severely underweight, probably 30% below his normal body mass. His fur was matted and dirty, and she could see several old wounds that had healed poorly. But most striking was his behavior. None of the skittish aggression typical of a wild bobcat. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to be back with familiar humans. "I'm going to set up the old enclosure in the barn," Margaret said. "Just temporarily until we can assess his health more thoroughly." Tom nodded, his attention focused entirely on Rusty. "I can't believe he came back. After all this time, he remembered us." "More than that," Margaret said, studying the bobcat's calm demeanor. "He sought us out. Something drove him to return here, to this specific place." They managed to coax Rusty into the barn without much difficulty. The bobcat seemed to remember the space, moving with more confidence once inside. Margaret set up bedding in the familiar enclosure while Tom continued to provide gentle reassurance. Over the following days, Rusty's story began to unfold through observation and deduction. Margaret's examination revealed telltale signs of his struggles in the wild. Healed claw marks from territorial disputes with other bobcats, evidence of a poorly set leg fracture that had caused a permanent limp, and signs of prolonged malnutrition. The winter must have been especially hard on him, Margaret explained to Tom as they watched Rusty rest in his temporary shelter. Young bobcats often struggle to establish territory in areas with established populations. He probably faced constant challenges from older, stronger cats. But he survived, Tom said with evident pride. He survived, but just barely. And something made him remember this place as safe. As Rusty regained his strength over the following weeks, his personality re-emerged. He seemed genuinely happy to interact with Tom and Margaret, often approaching the fence when they entered the barn. Unlike during his first stay, when maintaining his wild edge had been crucial for eventual release, Rusty now seemed content to accept human companionship. "What do we do now?" Tom asked one evening as they sat watching Rusty play with a rope toy. "He's clearly not thriving in the wild." Margaret had been wrestling with the same question. Professional ethics dictated that wildlife should remain wild, but Rusty's return suggested he had made his own choice about where he belonged. After several consultations with wildlife officials and veterinary colleagues, a solution emerged. The State Wildlife Refuge was looking for educational ambassadors, animals that, for various reasons, could not survive in the wild, but could help educate the public about wildlife conservation. "It's not what we planned for him," Margaret told Tom as they discussed the opportunity. "But maybe it's what he's choosing for himself." The application process took months, during which Rusty continued to recover his health and strength. His coat regained its luster, his weight returned to normal, but his contentment with human companionship never wavered. A new beginning. 1 year after Rusty's surprising return, Margaret stood in the education center at Whitefish Wildlife Refuge, watching her husband demonstrate proper wildlife interaction techniques to a group of fascinated schoolchildren. Rusty, now an official education ambassador, sat calmly on his specialized platform, alert but untroubled by the attention. "Can he be petted like a house cat?" asked a young girl in the front row. "No," Tom explained patiently. "Rusty is still a wild animal. He's comfortable with his handlers because we've worked with him for a long time, but he's not a pet. The most important thing to remember is that wild animals belong in the wild." Margaret smiled at the irony of that statement. Rusty had belonged in the wild, until he decided he belonged somewhere else. After the presentation, as tourists and students filtered out, Margaret watched Tom and Rusty interact. The bond between them had only deepened since Rusty's return. During training sessions, the Bobcat responded to Tom's voice commands with remarkable precision. More importantly, both man and animal seemed to have found a renewed sense of purpose. "You know what I think?" Margaret said as they prepared Rusty for transport back to his overnight habitat. "What's that?" "I think he never forgot what it felt like to be safe. And when survival in the wild became too difficult, he remembered where safety lived." Tom scratched Rusty behind the ear, earning a rare purr-like sound from the Bobcat. "Maybe we all need a place like that. A place we can return to when the world gets too hard." Margaret nodded, thinking about the unexpected ways life could come full circle. They had saved Rusty once as a helpless kitten. But in returning to them, weakened and worn by his struggles, he had given them something just as valuable. A reminder that love and safety create bonds that transcend the boundaries between human and wild. That sometimes the most profound relationships are forged not through possession, but through mutual choice. As they loaded Rusty into his transport carrier for the short ride to his evening quarters, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The scared kitten they had rescued had become a confident adult who chose his own path. The retired veterinarian and park ranger had found new purpose as educators and advocates. And perhaps most importantly, a bond that had seemed broken by time and distance had been renewed, proving that some connections run deeper than the call of the wild. Rusty settled into his carrier with familiar ease, his amber eyes meeting Margaret's through the mesh door. In that gaze, She saw not the desperation of the animal who had appeared on their doorstep months ago, but the contentment of a creature who had found his true home, not in the wilderness where he was born, but in the space between wild and domestic, where trust and respect created something entirely new. That evening, as Margaret and Tom sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they heard the distant call of wild bobcats in the forest. Tom stood and looked toward the refuge, where Rusty would be settling in for the night. "Think he ever misses it?" Tom asked. "The wild?" Margaret considered the question, remembering Rusty's visible contentment during that day's educational sessions, the way he seemed to take pride in his role as an ambassador for his species. "I think," she said finally, "he found something better. He found his purpose." As if in response to her words, a familiar call echoed across the distance. Not wild, not domestic, but something uniquely Rusty's own. It was answered by the voices of his wild cousins in the forest, a conversation between two worlds that had become one in the most unexpected way possible. Margaret reached for Tom's hand, and together they listened to this dialogue between wild and home, understanding that they had been privileged to witness one of those rare moments when nature writes its own rules about where creatures truly belong. Sometimes, the greatest act of wildness is choosing your own definition of home, and Rusty had done exactly that, traveling back through hardship and struggle to the place where he was first shown that survival and love could coexist. In the growing darkness, with the sounds of the Montana wilderness surrounding them, Margaret and Tom Russell knew they had been part of something remarkable. Not just the rescue and rehabilitation of an orphaned bobcat, but the creation of a bond that transcended all expectations about the relationship between human and wild. Rusty had come home not because he couldn't survive in the wild, but because he had learned the difference between existing and truly living. And he had chosen to live where love had first taught him what it meant to be safe. The story of Rusty's unexpected return would be told and retold at the refuge for years to come, inspiring countless visitors to reconsider their understanding of wildlife, family, and the complex relationships that can form between species. But for Margaret and Tom, the real story was simpler. Sometimes, when you open your door, you find that home has come looking for you, carrying memories of safety and love across miles of wilderness and months of hardship, proving that the strongest bonds are not always those we expect, but those we nurture with patience, respect, and hope.